Hi, my name is Natalie Sabick. I am an associate professor at the University of Rhode Island, and the poster presentation I'm sharing today is about whether gendered traits and gender ideology are associated with stress and burnout among midlife women. This is a population that is of great interest when thinking about burnout and chronic stress because women experience greater burnout than men, especially in this period of life. And this may largely be due to the competing demands that many women experience between work and caregiving. Initially, work on burnout was primarily focused on workplace settings, but it's really expanded in the last number of years to look at uncontrolled chronic stress in a variety of different domains. So, in the current research, we examine this in terms of work related burnout and personal burnout, which would be more in the home or domestic space. So, in this research, I hypothesized that traditional gender roles or traits could contribute to stress and burnout because these might increase the burden of emotional and household labor. And so, in both those domains, women may be taking on more or shouldering more burden and experiencing subsequent more stress. Um, I think as a result of either more feminine gender traits or embracing traditional gender ideology, which would skew towards them doing more domestic work. To test this hypothesis, we collected data from 301 women who are in that midlife range from 40 to 65 via an online survey. And women were located in the United States and the United Kingdom. I just want to note we collected this data in 2018 as part of a larger study in my research lab. And this was just before COVID. So the stress and other factors in this, just keep in mind, this is pre-COVID data that we're thinking about here. We used correlation and multiple regression analyses to examine associations between our study variables. When we were looking at gender ideology, we used the passive acceptance subscale of a measure of traditional gender roles. We used gendered traits, and we used the BEM sex role inventory to assess this, which is a widely used measure that looks at both feminine and masculine traits. And I'll talk about that and more in a moment. For stress, we use the perceived stress scale, a 10-item measure that also has been widely used in previous research. And to assess burnout, we use the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory. We selected this measure because it has both the work and the personal domains, which allowed us to extend our data beyond just looking at workplace stress, which we think is relevant to gender roles. We also wanted to examine whether stress was a mediator between the association of gender traits or gender ideology and burnout. And to look at that, we used a process macro developed by Hayes that works through SPSS. So looking at gendered traits from the BEM sex role inventory, a recent factor analysis identified three major traits that emerged reliably for women in this age range. And those included femininity or feminine traits, which are things like being affectionate, warm, and compassionate. So things you think of as being stereotypically feminine. And they also identified two different aspects of masculinity that came across in terms of groupings of traits. So the first was social masculinity, which was their term for it, which includes things like being dominant, aggressive, and assertive. And so I included a sort of negative symbol there because these are more negative aspects of masculinity. They also identified personal masculinity, and I included a little plus or positive sign there. These are more positive aspects of masculinity, like being independent, defending your beliefs, and taking a stand. And so we used this breakdown to assess whether those things were associated with burnout and stress in our study. Looking over at the results, I included a correlation table so that you could see sort of the breakdown of all the variables and how they related to each other. I will note that we controlled for a number of demographic factors that could be relevant here, including things like age, the number of children that you helped raise or that were living in your household, whether you were partnered or married or single. We included information about ethnic group and chronic health conditions, because those also can be really important indicators of how much stress or burnout a person reports. So all of the results control for that grouping of factors. So what we can note here is if you look at the first column, that's passive acceptance of traditional gender roles or that traditional gender ideology. what we saw is that it was not related to stress or burnout. So our hypothesis on that front was not supported. We did see that in the second and third column there, that femininity and personal masculinity, both of which are more positively valenced, they're sort of the positive aspects of femininity and the more positive aspects of masculinity, had a significant negative correlation with stress, with work-related burnout, and with personal burnout, indicating that overall, having more of those traits was associated with lower levels of stress and lower levels of burnout in both domains. Interestingly, social masculinity, which was that negatively valenced masculinity, the dominant, aggressive, and assertive, that was unrelated to our outcome variables of stress, work-related burnout, and personal burnout. Following up on that, we tested mediation, and at the in the far right column towards the bottom, those figures represent what we found. And we saw essentially the same sort of pattern for both the feminine traits and the personal masculine traits. And what we saw is that both of those traits were associated with lower levels of stress, and that stress was a mediator of the association between those traits and burnout. So that means that when we included stress in the model, the association between the traits and burnout was reduced. It went from being significant to being not significant. And there was a significant indirect effect that I've noted at the bottom of that column there. So what does this mean? In conclusion, the middle column here is where I'm looking. We know that positive aspects of personal gender traits, both masculine and feminine, were associated with lower stress and lower burnout. So again, this was interesting because it was counter to what we initially thought we would see, which is that more femininity, both in terms of traits and ideology, would be associated with higher stress. But instead, we're seeing that these traits are more protective, and that we may be able to leverage them to help reduce stress or reduce burnout. Very interestingly, we saw that traditional gender ideology was not a risk factor for higher stress or burnout. We also found that stress mediated the association between positive gender traits and burnout. And so relying more on cultivating or drawing on those traits in both work and personal domains may help reduce stress. And that's interesting to think about because burnout is generally characterized by depersonalization, disconnection, a lack of engagement, and it looks like the positive aspects of femininity and masculinity can protect against some of these outcomes. That may be because it fosters connection, particularly the feminine traits. Being affectionate, being compassionate may help reduce feelings of sort of loneliness, depression, or depersonalization. It may help people feel connected. And the personal masculinity is very interesting because being connected to your core values and beliefs, feeling empowered to take a stand, feeling like you're independent, and other traits that were on that subscale also look like a bit of a protective factor against stress and burnout. And so this is, again, counter to what we would expect to see, but also very enlightening in terms of the way that gender traits are functioning for women in this age group with relation to these outcome variables. So last, the thing that we noticed, because the hypotheses were not supported, is investigating things like mental load or the proportion of domestic work and gendered relations that women experience may be more fruitful for understanding that gendered imbalance in stress and burnout. So understanding why women experience more stress or burnout as compared to men. And that'll be interesting to probe in future studies. But this was a quick snapshot to give us some sense of how gender ideology and gendered traits are linked to stress and burnout among people identifying as women who are at that midlife phase.